Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Connecticut's Old State House. My name is Rebecca Tabor-Conover. I'm head of public programs here, and I'm delighted to see you all today for today's conversation at noon. I do want to do a little bit of a commercial before we get started. First of all, on your seats is a flyer for an upcoming program on January the 25th. It's on a Saturday. It's an encounters program on public punishment and race remembrance here at the Old State House. I hope you'll join us. And then our next conversation at noon will be on February the 11th, again at noon, and that program will be on Connecticut's African American soldiers in the Civil War. I also want to just mention that, as you probably have noticed, this program is being recorded by the Connecticut Network, and so you can view it, either download it or view it on television, and we would invite you to fill out the survey that is on your chair, because we do appreciate your feedback. It's always a special treat to be able to welcome friends back to the Old State House, and today we're delighted to welcome back Steve Thornton here to Connecticut's Old State House for today's program on Black activists in Hartford, the Easton family. This family, I think everyone will enjoy learning about, and I'm really excited that Steve's here to share more of his knowledge on this topic. I do want to mention that after the program, Steve will be selling books in our gift shop across the hall. As many of you know, Steve Thornton has researched and written extensively on current political issues and local people's history, particularly the forgotten stories of workers, for a variety of publications. Steve conducts city walking tours, workshops, and lectures in classrooms, churches, bars, union halls, and picket lines. I'd like to attend one of your lectures in a bar one of these days. Steve is the author of several books, including A Shoe Leather History of the Wobblies, Stories of the Industrial Workers of the World in Connecticut, Wicked Hartford, and Good Trouble, A Shoe Leather History of Nonviolent Direct Action. Steve maintains the Shoe Leather History Project, which is shoeleatherhistoryproject.com, which documents and explores progressive organizing from Hartford's grassroots. As you may guess, Steve has spent his adult life as an activist and organizer, and is a retired organizer with the largest healthcare workers union in Connecticut, District 1199, and the Greater Hartford Labor Council. Steve served on the National Steering Committee of the U.S. Labor Against the War, of which District 1199 was a founding member in 2003. Steve has been a resident of Hartford, Connecticut since 1973 and is a proud father, grandfather, and husband. Please join me in welcoming Steve Thornton.
Thanks, Rebecca. I was very pleased to be asked to speak at Hartford's 3 breweries last year. I spoke about the social history of beer and prohibition, and I had to learn a lot, but boy, it was a lot of fun it's a great audience at a brewery. I mean, they're really loose and having a lot of good time. Let me see how there we go. Thanks. My talk today is about the Easton family. When people are asked about Hartford history, if they know anything at all, this is what they know. They know these old white guys with beards. Oh, wait a minute. White guys with beards. Morgan Buckley, the governor, Samuel Colt, the manufacturer, Dr. Richard Gatling, who developed the Gatling gun, the first weapon of mass destruction, as I call it, and Horace Bushnell. But knowing these people is knowing only a small part of Hartford's history. And that's because Black history in Hartford, the history of working people in Hartford, has been covered and neglected. And I think to learn more about people like the Eastons is at least as important as these great men and the great men theory of history. Not knowing our own history and our own struggle, I think, leads us to despair and cynicism. This is a fairly despairing time, in my personal opinion, and a fairly cynical time. But I think what these people can show us is how they persevered. In 1899, Oh, let me just explain who they are at first in this artist's depiction, because there are no pictures of two of these, or photographs or paintings of two of these men, as far as I know. Sitting left is young Hosea Easton, a banjoist, stage performer. Standing in back of him is the Reverend Hosea Easton, who was a preacher and an author. And on the very right is Sampson Easton, and he's holding a long black cloth, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And of course, they're standing behind this beautiful building, the old State House. In 1899, the John Ferris Music Company of Hartford received a very unusual request. It was a letter relayed from Australia asking musicians in Hartford for any information that they might have about Hosea Easton, the banjoist. He had recently passed away in Sydney, Australia. A notice was placed in the Hartford Courant from the music store inquiring if any local resident could provide information on Easton, but nobody could. Nobody knew who he was, apparently. Almost 100 years later, in 1983, the city of Hartford government, the Vital Statistics Office, received another letter, this time from a researcher, Helen Armistead Jackson, a African-American researcher who wrote about African-American performers, stage performers around the United States, and she gathered information, all of which now is at the Schomburg Center in Harlem. She asked about Hosea Easton, too. She said, you know, he was born here in 1854. Can you tell me anything about him? And they couldn't either. They couldn't even find him in the statistics, the city's statistics. Pardon me. In fact, Hosea Easton was the grandson of the great and well-known intellectual abolitionist and author Reverend Hosea Easton, the first pastor of Hartford's first black church, the Talcott Street Congregational Church. So for me, the opportunity to uncover and recover the story about this performer who was unknown here but famous across the world seemed too important to ignore. So my research became a study of the family. And to orient us, let me show you a couple of maps. I hope this orients you rather than this is John Ferris's ad, by the way, one of his many ads. He was a very famous producer of banjos here in Hartford. This is an old picture of Hartford. On the right, up and down, is the Connecticut River, flowing north and north and south. And then where it says "You are here," that's the old State House, because that's where we are. And this is that map turned on its side so that north points towards the right of the picture. The old State House is circled, City Hall is circled, and the Talcott Street Church is circled. The two yellow row streets are Market Street going horizontally and Talcott Street traveling vertically to Connecticut River. I'm going to focus on these three members of the Easton family. As I said, there were no apparent pictures, photographs, or any other reproduction of the Reverend Hosea Easton or Sampson. But I will work with what I have and start with Caesar Easton. Caesar Easton was, they were from a free family, free since the 1690s. In Newport, Rhode Island, there was a slaveholder, Nicholas Easton, and his family joined the Quaker faith, and they emancipated these people, and they moved to Massachusetts. Caesar Easton was a landowner who fought off a series of challenges by white men attempting to claim his property as their own. And his son, James Easton, moved the family to eastern Massachusetts. They moved near a Wampanoag village in Brockton, Massachusetts, And the Wampanoag Indians were there were a number of them in that area still. And Caesar had a son named James. He married a woman named Sarah Dunbar, and they had 7 children, including the Reverend, who became the Reverend Hosea Easton. James was a veteran of the American Revolutionary War. He possessed Native American heritage. He was a blacksmith and an iron worker who sold industrial iron to big Boston construction projects. And he opened up a school for young black men, a trade school and an academic school, which was almost unheard of. Hosea, soon to be Reverend, attended that school in 1816. Hosea married a woman named Louisa Matrick and became a minister. He learned courage and activism from his family at a very young age. The local Congregational Church, which for a while allowed for black and white to sit together, decided they were going to segregate the church and set up what they called at that time euphemistically Negro porches or Negro pews. That was effectively segregating the black congregants from the white. James and Sarah Easton refused to sit there. They sat on the main floor of the church until they were physically removed. And this struggle went on. It continued for 40 years, not just at that church, but at each new church they moved to. At one point, they decided they were going to join a Baptist church, and they bought a pew from a sympathetic white member, and they installed it, and when they came back on Sunday, it was smeared with tar. So they took out the pew, and they brought their own chairs, and they sat in their own chairs. So they constantly, nothing that the church elders or members could do would stop them from attending church. So as a child and a teenager, Hosea Easton had engaged in at least 5 acts of civil disobedience from age 1 to teenage. He and his family were the first known African Americans who engaged in sit-ins for racial justice. Reverend Hosea Easton, who I have the depiction of on the right, and the Talcott Street Church on the left, he first came to prominence in 1830 with a Thanksgiving Day address in Providence, Rhode Island, which was then published. It was a frank, explicit, angry condemnation of the brutalities of slavery, mixed with a call for a spiritual uplift of black people. Reverend Easton continued to write about slavery and about prejudice, which was the word for racism back then, including institutional racism. He published in the Liberator, which was the famous abolitionist newspaper of the famous abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. And his second published piece was called A Treatise on the Intellectual Character and Civil and Political Condition of the Colored People of the United States and the Prejudice exercised toward them. He published this in 1837. In this, which was his definitive work, he not only excoriated institutional and personal racism that he experienced and that, in fact, the black population as a whole experienced, but he also talked against the genocide of the Native American. There's nobody doing that at that time. Certainly not any white intellectuals talking about what has already just taken place, and that is wiping out Native Americans. He also spoke out against the U.S. war against Mexico at the time, which was nothing more than a land grab by slaveholders who wanted to extend slavery out to the West. Easton looked past the formal end of slavery, which he had no doubt was going to happen. He called for what we would now consider Reconstruction and reparations. He was speaking about these things long before anyone else was. Quote, emancipation embraces the idea that the emancipated must be placed back where slavery found them, he wrote, and restore them all that slavery has taken away from them. Merely to cease beating the colored people and leave them in their gore and call it emancipation is nonsense. Nothing short of the entire reversal of the slave system in theory and in practice would suffice, he wrote. Now, he was not only the first pastor of the Talcott Street Church, he was the first schoolmaster. He started a school when black children didn't go to school anywhere at the time, and he started one right in the church. And then he started a second black church in Hartford, the AME Baptist Church on Pearl Street. So in the few years that he actually lived in Hartford, 33 to 37, he was very, very accomplished. Now, he predicted, I think, his own terminal diagnosis because he died in 1837, and we don't know how. It was never publicly listed. His mother lived to be 73. His father had died when he was 76, so there wasn't anything, there was no, family hereditary diseases or anything like that. He died just around 38 years of age, and he predicted his death in the treatise this way. Quote, "The effect of racism is everywhere manifest among the colored people. I will venture to say from my own experience and observation that hundreds of them come to an untimely grave by no other disease than oppression," unquote. He expected to publish a new volume of work immediately after the treatise. It was to be called Civil, Social, and Moral Economy, but 4 months after the publication of the treatise, he died, and the next book never came. Now, I'm going to take a very short break here. This is, by the way, is Faith Congregational Church, the descendant and very active church in Hartford now that traces its roots back to Talcott Street Church. I mentioned that Hosea Easton started a school at his church. He also attempted to start a school in Yale, a trade school, along with other, sometimes more famous abolitionists, and they were run out of town before they got started, just as Prudence Crandall was run out of town. These are all within the same decade. I'm going to take a small break in our narrative here, which is, I know, disrupting, but it's too important to ignore, and that is to acknowledge the African American women who built the black community in Hartford, since there is very, very little info about them and fewer pictures, photographs, or paintings, but their contributions were enormous and need much more study. So Anne Plato, who was a poet and wrote her book at age 16. Nancy Jackson, an enslaved woman who lived in Hartford with a family and sued to free herself from the slave owner that was coming back to get her. Hetty Primus, who helped found the Freedmen's Society, which supported Reconstruction after the war, and her daughter, Rebecca Primus, who was a teacher down south during Reconstruction. These were all extraordinarily important women. But today I'm focusing on the Eastons. Hartford was a prosperous city, but there were very large communities, significant communities of poverty. Black community was one of them, and more immigrant communities became them. Irish and then Italian communities also all ended up operating in the same part of the city, which is the East Side here, what used to be called Front Street neighborhood when I was young. Sampson Easton was, one more thing about the Hartford. Hartford was also a port city, and this is a beautiful painting of it, and I assume this is fairly accurate, around the same time that we're talking. You see the old State House in the background. It was a port city, which meant a number of things, including that this is sometimes where the Underground Railroad operated. If they didn't operate by land, they operated by water. And there are stories about how they successfully avoided slave catchers, or man stealers, as the abolitionists called them. Slavery during this time was still, even in the North, very much connected to slavery in the South. If there were only a relatively limited number of people who were enslaved, it still had a profound effect on the entire community. Some of them were living incognito, and they were living hidden in plain sight. Reverend James Pennington from the Talcott Street Church was one of them. He had actually escaped slavery. He became a minister, operated under a different name. He was Jim Pembroke, and then he became James Pennington. Again, Pennington had been a Quaker, and operated for years that way. So Hartford was an important stopping point and an important flashpoint in terms of slavery. Reverend Hosea's son, Sam Easton, attempted to say, I'm going to talk very, very briefly about three examples of his extraordinary bravery and his justice character. He wasn't a famous man, unlike his father or ultimately his son. He was named after his mother's father, Sampson Dunbar, in Massachusetts. He was Sampson Easton. First, in 1858, 2 years before the Civil War, he attempted to save Aunt Mary Robinson. She was known as Aunt Mary, a longtime friend, from being killed by her husband. By all accounts, Sampson tried to peacefully de-escalate the fight between the two. It was actually an attack by Ben on Mary. And Ben assaulted him, wounding him, stabbing him, when he stepped in the middle of the fight, attempting to stop Ben from assaulting his wife. She ultimately died. He was sent to prison, but he had put himself in the middle of that attack because he saw it going on. Now, he was an entrepreneur who lived right in this area and various locations. He was listed as a livery driver and a hack driver in 1858 and 1859, but he also owned the Easton Academy of Music on Commerce Street in 1860, where he crafted, repaired, and played banjos and fiddles and possibly other musical instruments. And that's probably also where he had a dance hall, sort of a public dance hall where members of the community showed up. His business bordered the Connecticut River, Commerce Street, which was always flooding because it was the only property available to him. In April, just at the beginning of the Civil War, a local woman named Mrs. Thomas Flaherty attempted to commit suicide by jumping off the railroad bridge into the Connecticut River. Sampson jumped into the cold river and rescued her with some difficulty. He brought her to shore, and she rewarded him with a slap in the face. I could find no evidence that the two knew each other. This was likely a spur-of-the-moment decision on his part, and again, I think it shows his character and his personal courage. It turns out that Sampson Easton and John Brown, the famous abolitionists, their lives intertwined. This is maybe the first portrait of John Brown. It was taken in Hartford, and it was taken by the daguerreotypist Augustus Washington, African-American photographer, who was also a teacher and an active member in the Talcott Street Church. This is a portrait much later, closer to his death. And maybe the moment for which Sam Easton should be remembered occurred on December 2nd, 1859. A dance was being held at the State House Square, right here, And it was sponsored by the Hartford Fire Department. At about 2 a.m. on Saturday morning, some of the dancers saw a light emanating from the cupola of the old State House just above us. They called on a police officer who climbed to the belfry and apprehended Sam Easton, as he was described in the newspaper, a colored citizen of this city, which was actually quite a nice way for newspapers to describe any black people at the time, and relatively nice, and his white companion from New Haven, Charles Boyle. Although they were arrested, Easton and Boyle had completed their objective by draping the figure of justice outside on the top of the building with sable fabric in view of the execution that was to take place in Charlottesville, Virginia, later that day. The condemned man was Connecticut-born John Brown, and he had electrified the nation, as we know, in his October raid against the government arsenal in Harper's Ferry. He was mourning John Brown, and he was doing it in the most public way that he knew how. The local pro-slavery Democrats at the time insisted that Sampson was being manipulated, that he was given money, that he was hired by Republicans to perform the symbolic action, but Easton denied it. Easton and Boyle spent the night in Hartford, in the Hartford jail, while the authorities tried to figure out how to charge them. It was decided, and I'll read this directly, that the two, quote, could be charged with neither insurrection nor resurrection and were released at noon, an hour after John Brown was hanged. I found that this is a late 19th century picture of the State House. The cupola, Lady Justice, and this is a depiction of Sampson Easton on the left. Now I'm going to finish up with Hosea Easton the younger, Sampson's son, the musical virtuoso, sometimes called the Prince of Banjoists. I began my research with this man, arguably at the time the most well-known of the Eastons, because he was known along the Pacific Rim for maybe 20, 30 years. He was Reverend Hosea's grandson, Sampson's son, and he was born to 20-year-old Louisa Matrick around 1854. At some point in his life, young Hosea picked up one of the banjos his father Sampson had made. He was really good. Minstrel shows and other variety acts frequently visited Hartford at the Roberts Opera House or at Allen Hall. Both venues were just a short walk from his neighborhood. We don't know for sure if young Hosea saw any of these performances, but it seems very likely. The white blackface acts, were the leading performers since the 1830s in this particular musical format known as minstrelsy. They perpetuated the offensive stereotype that deliberately corrupted the image of African Americans among white people, including those in Hartford who saw them. On left hand, this is one iteration of the original Georgia minstrels. They took each other's names and stole each other's names, these whiteface, blackface troops. And on the right is actually an all-black minstrel show which focused on Lincoln and emancipation. In 1866, the Georgia Minstrels, with an all-black cast, advertised "No burnt cork here," meaning there were no white performers in blackface made by burnt cork. They boasted that they had replaced the white performers who sang and played in blackface, And they were later endorsed by none other than the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who, according to one advertisement, was quoted as saying, quote, "No imputation can be brought against them of presenting anything offensive to the eye or ear." And then a year or later, they were commended by Oliver Wendell Holmes and P.T. Barnum. Now, that may sound odd, but P.T. Barnum was very famous, and he was anti-slavery. He wasn't exactly an abolitionist, but he was anti-slavery. So they were using their good offices to promote their work as non-offensive. Minstrelsy, of course, is offensive, and it's weighted with a lot of negative baggage, and rightly so. This highly popular form of entertainment arose in part from the fascination that white people had with the African American experience. Blackface featured white men in grotesque makeup, singing and dancing with an exaggerated parody of black performers. But in some audiences, and this was because many audiences had never seen black musicians or actors or had no contact with the black community at all. The blackface only enhanced white racism and widened the gulf between the races. Yet the musical genre also fostered, and this is not to excuse it, but it also fostered other musical forms. Jubilee music, which we now call spirituals, ragtime, and ultimately jazz, all of which entered into the wider public culture. And while black minstrels played to the images of white audiences, they also subverted those images. As the poet Amiri Baraka wrote, in one sense, the colored minstrel was poking fun at himself, and in another, probably more profound sense, he was poking fun at the white men. By the time he was 27 years old, Easton had joined the original Georgia Minstrels. Just because they called themselves original doesn't mean they were the first troupe to use that name, but that was their name. He left Hartford and landed in Hobart, Australia, as a member of that troupe. The troupe was at the height of its popularity along the Pacific surface, especially in Australia, New Zealand, and Taiwan. He was singled out by a newspaper reviewer of the Sydney Mail, who wrote, quote, that he draws consistently on theology and temperance for his witticisms. Hosea also performed with groups such as the Mastodon Minstrels of Hong Kong, and various black American shows although they were also popular, but there was little stability in the business because they were run by white folks, they were cheated, there was outright racism by the owners and sometimes by the audiences. So there was frequent turnover, and there was a lot of, it was not a steady job to be a black minstrel. But Hosea was luckier than many. He hooked up with C.B. Hicks, the African-American impresario and leader of the original Georgia Minstrels. Hicks was described as possessing a capable management style and engaged in, quote, combative efforts to maintain independence from the white theatrical establishment. Quickly, Hosea became an audience favorite. He entertained people with, quote, clever banjo solos, riffed on popular airs, which earned frequent encores. Crowds were huge, and special trains were scheduled to bring fans into cities from the outlying Australian countryside to see him and the troupe perform. At the beginning of every performance, Hicks addressed the audience and focused the show's narrative. He spoke of the African-American fight for freedom, and he talked about the Georgia troops' history. Most of the time, that was welcome, but occasionally one newspaper critic or another would complain that the public had paid admission for their music, not to, quote, sympathize with their condition. But that was rare. In general, they got wild reviews. By the way, Hicks is in the middle there, and Hosea is number number 3, sort of at 11 o'clock, if that's taken as a half circle. And this is a close-up of that picture. In mid-1878, Hicks teamed up with a dramatic company and performed the internationally acclaimed Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It was made as a play, and she generally had nothing to do with it, so anybody could take the play and rewrite it, which they did constantly. Sometimes they did a very good job, and many times they did a very poor job. But he played Uncle Tom, and he was the first African American to play it in the Southern Hemisphere, and the second black man to play it in all the world. One other man had played it in the United States. It ran for 12 weeks to sold-out audiences in Melbourne, Australia. Hosea then expanded to other roles, including the theatrical performance of Harriet Beecher Stowe's drama Dread, A Tale from the Great Dismal Swamp, which, if you think Uncle Tom was a little too soft, Dread was a fire-eating revolutionary. So she balanced, with her 2 big hits, she balanced sort of the view of black life at the time. And he was Dread in that, his name was Dread in that production. He eventually formed his own ensemble, the Easton Uncle Tom Company, which toured with other racially integrated dramatic and musical acts. He spent the rest of his life in Australia. Here he is, 3 pictures of him as Uncle Tom. Although Uncle Tom in the novel was a young, strong man, in almost all the stage productions, he was an older, more gentle, more Christian, more loving, white-haired old man. And that's the way they played him here. That's what people knew him as. He spent his life in Australia, an extraordinarily beloved figure, until his death in 1899. When he was hospitalized, other performers staged a benefit concert to help pay for his medical costs. And when he died of cancer, his large funeral became a parade of 2,000 musicians and fans marching down the street to the cemetery. That's how much of a celebrity he was and how much he was loved. This is a reproduction of the Waverly Cemetery program. He was feted again when Waverly Cemetery was celebrating its own anniversary, and he was given a big, along with other musical performers, he was given a page that described who he was. Still remembered in Australia, unlike in this country. The story of the Eastons in Hartford should not be a mystery any longer. Their history has been, their stories have been erased by racism, by neglect, for far too long. They're among the many examples of African American men and women who can teach us still about courage and strength and perseverance. That can inspire us and give us hope, I believe. And I think we owe it to all of them to carry that tradition and that message forward. Thank you very much for listening. I threw a lot of information at you, and there may be stuff that I garbled or that you didn't understand or that you'd like more information about. If you have questions or comments, take them now. Yeah. One and then 2.
That was fascinating and outstanding.
Thanks. You always like the stuff I do.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if you could give us a biography of your research. How did you find all this material?
His original writing, Hosea the preacher, William Lloyd Garrison's articles from the Liberator, the local newspapers, Hartford Current, There was also the Charter Oak, which was an abolitionist newspaper that was printed here. At least one grad student thesis who covered some part of something. And I went down to the Schomburg Center for the Research in Black Culture in Harlem, and I went there a couple of times because there was some information there that Helen Armistead Johnson had collected. So I guess that kind of covers it all. I didn't know that these people were related to each other at first. I just said, oh, people named Easton. But the black community was very small. And the fact that there might be 3 Eastons in the same small area who were not related, I thought was unlikely. So the more I dug, the more I found that was correct. Now, just to confuse us, Sampson had a brother named Hosea, and a son named Hosea, and a father named Hosea. But I've left out, unfortunately, that brother because I did not find anything except for some misdemeanors that, as a young person, that he was convicted of stealing hams and stuff like that. But that doesn't, I don't mean to cast aspersions. It's just that I decided I was going to focus on those 3. And I could find nothing about Sampson's mother or Sampson's wife. And that's a shame, but I worked with what I had.
So on the grandfather Hosea, you commented that you didn't know if any other writers were talking about the oppression of Native Americans. I mean, it seems to me that he was simultaneous with William Apess, a Pequot, who was writing about this, and they might even have known each other.
Yeah.
A-P-E-S-S.
Yeah, right. It's quite. He was very well read, and in fact, a lot of his treatise talks about how the black people were the sort of founders of civilization, and he talked about all the accomplishments, and then he talked about Europe and the terrible things that went on in Europe, like between the Crusades and the Inquisition and the Black Plague, and so he had read a lot, and he incorporated it, he synthesized it into his writing. So it's possible. Also, Anne Plato was probably Native American, part Native American too, the 16-year-old poet. And she wrote a poem about a grandfather talking to his granddaughter about what had happened to their race. And that was pretty unusual too, because I checked the history books of the time, and there are no history books that gave a good version of what had happened to Indians in New England. There was a question over here. Yeah.
It's a great presentation, and I unfortunately came in a little bit late, so you may have covered this. But how did Hosea, the preacher, wind up coming to Hartford? Was the Talcott Street Church, did he start that? And then the second question is, are there any descendants of the family living in Hartford right now?
Essentially, since he was the first pastor, he was sort of instrumental in getting it up and running. Now, actually, in 1819, the black community who was going to the first church at the time left because they were being segregated as well. And they said, no, that's not the way we're going to worship. So they left the first church and for a number of years sort of just operated on their own, but without a formal church and without a building. And so the Talcott Street Church was built. It was built in a sense with him in mind because they were going to hire him. How he learned about the job, I don't know. But there was a network of people of anti-slavery and abolitionists between Connecticut and Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So my guess is he got the job advertisement. The second question was?
Descendants?
I only know of some descendants of the Dunbar family, which is his mother's side. Hosea's wife, or grandmother, was Hosea's mother was a Dunbar. And the Dunbars have been doing their research, but they didn't know anything past until, when he got to Hartford, their inquiry sort of stopped. So I'm sure there are Eastons, but I don't have the resources to find out who they are. I sure would like to know. Other questions or comments that people have? Yes.
Very good presentation. I have 2 questions. Number one, you mentioned the Reverend Easton formed later a Baptist church. Was there any? I assume there was some controversy with that.
You'd think so, although I haven't found any. I have realized that in the black community, people could be Congregationalists, Baptists, or Presbyterians, and they could switch back and forth. So James Pennington, who I mentioned before, was a Presbyterian, but he comes and he takes over a Congregational church. Hosea Easton takes over starts a Baptist church. In Massachusetts, Hosea's parents switched from one church to another. So to them, there wasn't such a great identification with one form of faith, not nearly as much as the white people.
You also mentioned Sampson had a dance hall. Do you know if it was integrated or not?
I don't know. I think not. It was not. It was sort of seen as a place of ill repute, but it wasn't. They weren't doing anything illegal, as far as I know. It just got described as a low dance hall, which means, it wasn't a high dance hall, I guess. Other questions that people have? Comments? Anything at all? Yeah.
So, 1836, the sort of sudden death.
Yeah.
I would never count out cholera. So I don't know whether it was there in Hartford then, but poor people were dying because they were in the worst places for it. So,
yeah. Well, I'm not sure if you came in when I read about what he wrote about. He predicted his own diagnosis. He said a lot of people are just dying from oppression.
right.
He said, and he didn't say like they were being shot or they were being malnourished, or it was just the weight, the burden of living where the entire society is set up in a racist hierarchy.
That's great. There's a book by Charlene Crothers, Unapologetic. She's not a historian, she's a sociologist, but she's writing about how African Americans have to understand that they are the essence of resistance and fighting oppression in the U.S., and that it has these really, really deep roots. And what you're doing here is exactly a similar kind of thing for Hartford, going back, taking all these, it's a lot of research and a lot of efforts, essentially tapping into what that, that core that existed. Do you know of any secondary stuff that's been written on like abolition movements in Hartford? I mean, you got Harriet Beecher Stowe. Twain comes later. He's looking for money, I think, more than anything else. But is there anything written about
Well,
it?
I've done some other writing about it, but I don't really know. There's a book called The Middle Class in Hartford by Barbara Beeching. There's a book called African Americans in Connecticut during the and those give sort of surveys of conditions, and they're good in terms of statistics and incidents and stuff like that. My stories are always anecdotal. So when I find that this guy dies young and then he predicts it, when I read closely his treatise and that he predicts it, that to me says, loads. It really, really is quite profound. And so I sort of draw off those. There was the man, William Burleigh, white man who was the head of the abolitionist paper here, was a teacher for James Easton's trade school up in Massachusetts. His brother was an abolitionist, and he was, I think, very helpful in terms of this community, but we don't know much about him. I don't know much about him. So,
That's great, thanks.
sure. Yeah. Other questions, comments? Come on, I know you're thinking, I don't know if I should ask that. Yes, the young lady in the back.
Is it true that there's a street named after him in Australia?
Easton?
Yes.
I don't know.
I
Oh, wait a minute. I think I read that. Yeah, I mean, anybody who is a student of the history of the banjo knows who this guy is. Anybody who's a student of the stage in Australia knows who this guy is. He is one of those performers who just was put prominently where he deserved to be, as a very popular entertainer, and one with a great deal of dignity, but was also really, really talented and really clever. And so he got a lot of props for that. And I think I remember that they named a street after him, but I can't grab it at the moment from my head. Other comments or questions? Yes.
Yes, I understand that the Eastons are like children of the founder of Newport. And was their father, did the father contribute to them financially? Were they pretty well off?
That's a good question. Reverend Hosea was like third or fourth generation from Newport. There were 3 or 4 generations of free men and women who left Newport because the Quaker side of the Easton family emancipated them. And I don't know that they left with any money or resources or livestock at all, but they had they had skills. So James Easton was a blacksmith, and he was in effect an engineer. So he traded off that skill to build his own business and a trade school. So from there, his children got pretty good educations, and they had their own skills that they were able to develop. Hosea developed his mind and his soul and became very active in abolitionist politics in Massachusetts and Connecticut. There again, he's not really credited with it. So if you ask somebody, well, you remember that New Haven trade school that all the people in New Haven were about to run them out on a rail when they were trying to build that school for young black men? And they'll say, oh yeah, I was Tappan, and that was so-and-so and so-and-so. But actually, Hosea Easton was very much a part of that. He just didn't have the status to be mentioned in all that, that description, it seems. But he started his own school here in Hartford, and he followed in that trail. So I think they brought mostly their skills and their determination with them. And James Easton had to learn being a blacksmith somewhere, so he learned it probably maybe from Massachusetts, maybe from Rhode Island. I don't know for sure. Other questions? Thoughts? Concerns? Stuff you think, oh, Steve, I wish you had said this instead, or I wish you hadn't said this. Go ahead.
Why the attraction in Australia? What was so attractive?
Well, minstrel shows went all across the country. When they were in California, they had no place to go except across the ocean, and there was a call for, the colonists essentially in Australia were looking to be more. They built opera houses, and they said, let's fill them full of somebody, and so they got folks from the west coast of the United States. And I think that these entrepreneurs were just that. They were looking for places to play. Australia was also a relatively less racist. I say that at my peril, because the way they treated Aboriginal people was exactly the same as Native American people were treated. But they didn't have the same. They hadn't turned slavery into a religion the way we, sort of demonic religion the way that we did here. And so it was a rough time, but it didn't mean that they couldn't be on stage and that they couldn't work with with white actors, for instance. They could. So I don't know for sure, but I think it's because Australia was trying to import culture. Yes, one and then two.
Thank you. It's kind of off topic, but you did mention briefly about the black women here in the state of Connecticut and also in Hartford. Do you have any more information or any more readings that you recommend? I've heard recently of Maria Stewart, who was an abolitionist here, who went to court on her own behalf and freed herself. Do you have any more information or books or readings that you would recommend for learning more about the black women and their works here in the state of Connecticut?
Yeah, on my website, Shoe Leather History Project, my longer version of this story and also of the Talcott Street Church lists those women that I mentioned in more detail. And although I don't necessarily list all my sources in these articles, I could always give you some names of books where I've got the start from. It's useful, although it usually takes in their whole lives, and then there's this much about Hartford, but that's okay because you can go from there. You can move from there. So James Mars, for instance, there's his autobiography. He was a man who was enslaved, who freed himself, and he was the one who helped Nancy Jackson, the young enslaved woman, from getting out from under her, the man who claimed her as his property. And that's a great story, and he talks about it. But there's even more of that. For instance, Bessie Rayna, people know the poet Bessie Rayna. She's written about a poem about Nancy Jackson, which is extraordinary. And she told me something I didn't know, and that is that when she was going to court, she had cyanide with her. So if she was found guilty, she was not going to let them take her back. I think that's extraordinary. Now, I believe that if she was found guilty, the Talcott Street Church would have disappeared her and taken care of her. I truly, truly believe that. James Mars would have. But she felt she had no other choice but to prepare. And that's an amazing, awful, but amazing story. So I can give you my information, and I can get you some book titles. I'd be glad to do that. Yes?
I just wondered, do you know how long the trade schools existed and how successful they were?
Yeah, there's vagueness there, that's historical vagueness, but I think that James Easton's trade school in Massachusetts, where young Hosea, soon to be Reverend Hosea, was trained, I think it lasted 15 to 20 years. But I think it was a successful school, but I think it faced hostility as well. And so it's vague, but it was finally, the Reverend talks about how it had to be shut down, not because they wanted to. I think their school existed until the public schools opened up themselves to black students, it was still segregated, but they started earning their responsibility towards educating young black students. So I don't know quite how long, but I have a feeling they were doing this for many years, for maybe a couple of generations. I know there were a lot of, Ann Plato was a teacher, Augustus Washington was a teacher, and others who are well known. So, obviously, its story got around. Want to kick us out? Okay. Anything else before we go? I have 2 books. They're going to be in the store over here. One is called Wicked Hartford. It's a lot of the same kind of history and more. And Good Trouble. There's a picture of Congressman John Lewis on the cover, which is about how people over the decades in this city have fought back with nonviolence for social justice, racial justice. So thanks very much for your attention. I really, really appreciate it. And I'll see you again soon, I hope.